Every fantasy offseason, all everyone seems to want to talk about is the sleepers. The players who are going way low in the draft, who everyone is convinced is going to win you your leagues. I've never been big on sleeper talk. I think it's much more important to just nail the first 6 rounds. That's a much more feasible path to success. But every year, there are players who come out of the 13th, 14th, 15th round and who put up numbers way more than anyone could have expected. Players who, in retrospect, should have been going in the 7th or 8th round, but instead went 5 rounds later and become anchors of often fantasy championship winning teams. So there is value in discussing players who are going late in the draft, who could provide value much greater than their draft position would suggest, and who could be the bump to get your roster over the edge. So today, I'm going to talk about a couple players who I think have paths to being fantasy relevant, or who I think at their ADP could be strong, sort of like the glue to hold together a very well-built roster, because you can get them later in drafts when you've presumably already taken a bunch of high-impact, bona fide stud players. So I'm going to talk about 7 players today who I think could help you win your fantasy league. So without further ado, let's get into it. With some Carolina Panthers players who are making a little bit of noise. First up is Jalen Coker. He's the wide receiver 54, 131st overall player. And this is a guy who very clearly the Panthers believe in. We haven't seen him put it all together yet, but clearly the Panthers believe he can. They gave him a very nice extension this offseason, 3 years, $41 million. And Bryce Young, there's clearly room in this offense for another pass catcher to succeed. Right now, it's Tetairoa McMillan and basically no one else. They don't have a tight end. They didn't bring any significant wide receiver competition in. So it seems like this wide receiver room for this year is going to be Tetairoa McMillan and Jalen Coker. I don't really believe in Xavier Legette. I fully believe Jalen Coker can jump him. So you're looking at a guy who's going to be a wide receiver 2 on a team that made the playoffs last year. The problem is the Panthers, and more specifically Bryce Young, are a little sketchy at times. Bryce Young is a very up and down passer. He doesn't consistently put up reliable passing numbers. He had a lot of games last year where he would alternate between like 120 passing yards and then the next week throw for 300 passing yards. And that's not really what you want for a guy to be a consistent fantasy starter. Even in your flex spot, you don't want him to be attached to a quarterback who is going to fall off the wagon every other week. So that's the main problem with Jalen Coker, is I don't know if we can trust Bryce Young to not only consistently produce fantasy output for 2 receivers. I don't know if you can trust Bryce Young to consistently put out fantasy production for just Tetairoa McMillan. I'm scared about Tet McMillan's price and his outlook with Bryce Young at quarterback. The thing about Jalen Coker is, as is a theme in a lot of this video, he's free. He's the wide receiver 54. He's going in the 11th round. If you think there's going to be a bit of a Bryce Young step forward this year, he's going to be a more consistent passer, I would get on Jalen Coker instead of Tetairoa McMillan because he's cheap. If you think that Bryce Young is going to be able to sustain a semi-consistent level of passing production, you think there's going to be enough to go around for Tetairoa McMillan to be the alpha and Jalen Coker to be the second guy, why not draft him? The Panthers believe in him. I think the talent is there. The only thing I would say is that I don't know if his offense may hold him back in the long run. But with these dart throws, I think Jalen Coker is a perfectly reasonable guy to throw a dart at because there's evidence that he could be a fantasy relevant receiver this year. All right, how about another Carolina Panther offensive skill player who's making some noise this offseason? Let's talk about Jonathan Brooks, Panthers running back, RB42, 132nd overall player. Jonathan Brooks is a guy who's had a really sad and unfortunate career so far. Coming out of college, he was coming off an ACL tear, spent the first couple of weeks on the PUP list, comes back in his first game, immediately re-tears his ACL and misses both the second half of his rookie season and all of his sophomore season. So now, going into year 3, Jonathan Brooks is a mystery man. We have no idea who he is. He was a very highly touted prospect coming out of Texas, but we've never seen his ability on an NFL field. We don't know if he's a good NFL running back. He's had 9 career carries in 1 game. So why are we talking about him if he's this mystery guy? Well, it's because he's in a backfield with Chuba Hubbard. And Chuba Hubbard was a good running back at one point. But over the past year, he's shown that his job security might not be as stable as once thought. Last year, Rico Dowdle kind of came into the Panthers' backfield and stole Chuba Hubbard's lunch money. And yeah, Chuba Hubbard kind of had a late season resurgence where he started to get some more work in that backfield back. But still, he's shown that his stranglehold on the Panthers' backfield is not very tight. There is absolutely room for a skilled player to come in and get work in this backfield. And now, with Rico Dowdle being shipped off in this offseason, the guy who would stand to take Chuba Hubbard's job would be the Panthers' second-round pick and the first running back off the board in 2024, Jonathan Brooks. The only question just is, can he do it? I think he can. I think he was super talented. I think ACL surgeries have come a long way from where they were 5-10 years ago, and I think he can absolutely bounce back even after 2 ACL injuries. However, one thing that doesn't have to be noted with Jonathan Brooks is just what is going to be the timetable of when he takes this job from Chuba Hubbard. Because it's probably not going to be for maybe a month. You might get a month into the season, and Chuba Hubbard might still be getting double-digit carries every week, with Jonathan Brooks working in every other drive, and he might not be a fantasy startable asset. And the thing about fantasy is everyone likes to talk about the league winners who are going to win you week 15, 16, 17 in the playoffs. To get to the playoffs, you have to win enough games. And if you're losing a bunch of games early in the year, you're not going to make the playoffs, regardless of who you have on your roster at the end of the year. So if Jonathan Brooks takes, a month longer to become fantasy relevant, he's not going to be helpful. He's just going to be sitting on your bench, and he's not going to be a useful fantasy asset. So I think the thing with Jonathan Brooks is you need to look at your roster going into, as it progresses through the fantasy draft, and see, can I afford to have a player who's just sitting on my bench and not producing potentially for the first 3 or 4 weeks until he hopefully wrestles this job away from Chuba Hubbard? And if the answer is no, you might need to go a different direction, because there are skilled players around Jonathan Brooks who are going to have more immediate impact. Josh Downs, Jaden Reed, Bill Krosky-Merritt, all going around Jonathan Brooks, and all should have more immediate outcomes. Now, Jonathan Brooks in the long run may be a better pick, because if he does wrestle this job away from Chuba Hubbard, he could end the season putting up low-end RB1 numbers. The question, though, is when will he wrestle this job away, and will he at all? However, I do think Jonathan Brooks, at current value, RB42, is an elite pick. However, if he starts to rise, I would be concerned about what he brings to the fantasy table immediately if he cannot wrestle that job away from Chuba Hubbard until much later in the season. All right, next up, let's talk about some quarterbacks. First up, Tyler Shough, New Orleans Saints quarterback, QB20, 122nd overall ADP. Shough was sort of a surprise fantasy darling down the stretch of last year's season. You look at his numbers, 14.4 points per game, played in 8 games. That's not too terribly impressive. However, when you look at what he did in his last 6 games, he averaged 20 points a game. So if you kind of exclude those first games where there was a game where he came in relief of Spencer Rattler. There was a couple, and then there's a few games where he was getting his feet wet as a rookie. If you excuse those games and look at what he did in the last 6 weeks, he was the QB 8 overall, 20 points per game. Like, are you serious? That's insane. And yes, there was a little bit of rushing shenanigans in some games. He scored 3 rushing touchdowns in those weeks. I don't know if he'll continue rushing for those numbers with an improved New Orleans run game, with the addition of Travis Etienne this offseason. But with another offseason of progression and development in Kellen Moore's system, I wonder what Tyler Shough could do, especially at his value of QB20. He's going not as a starting fantasy quarterback if you're not in a Superflex league. If you're not in a Superflex league, this guy should be, the latest of late round picks, if not available on waiver wire, depending on how many QBs your league mates like to roster, if they like to have a backup QB or not. And at that value, I think Tyler Shough is a guy who, if you build a very strong roster through your fantasy draft and you're nailing your picks, Tyler Shough could be a guy who you pick up in your last 2 rounds and who just anchors the quarterback position for your roster, which should include a lot of elite running backs and receivers. And if they're always scoring a bunch of points, I think Shough could put up, 17 or 18 points every week, or average that, and be a guy who just anchors your roster and prevents it from collapsing. he is a very good value pick. I don't know if what his ceiling is. I don't know what his upside is. He obviously had those 20 points per game stretch down the end. I don't know if that's sustainable for him, but I do think that he's basically free because he's at the end of your draft, and there is a possibility world where Kellen Moore has talked a lot about wanting to throw the ball this offseason. There's a world where Tyler Shough just starts chucking that football. They added Jordan Tyson this season. They have Chris Olave already, 2 elite receivers. What if Shough throws for like 28, 29 touchdowns? What if he reps out a Bo Nix type season, ends his QB8, and all of a sudden you've got a low-end QB1 who you drafted outside the top 12 QBs almost as a QB3. That's how far down he is. And I think that at that value, there's no reason to not take a dart throw at Tyler Shough. Sure, you might want to draft someone else in conjunction with Tyler Shough. Maybe take Jared Goff. Maybe take Malik Willis or another guy who we're about to talk about in Kyler Murray. But I think Shough has a very high fantasy outlook. I don't know how high his ceiling is, but I think his floor is high enough to where if you build a good roster around him, there's no reason why he couldn't be a perfectly reasonable quarterback for your fantasy team. The other quarterback I want to highlight in this video is Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray has been a really interesting fantasy quarterback throughout his career. He's a guy who obviously has a high rushing upside. We love rushing quarterbacks in fantasy because running for 10 yards scores you a lot more points than passing for 10 yards. So we love rushing quarterbacks because they have this built-in cheat code. However, Kyler has been interesting because his rushing has really been the only thing keeping him fantasy relevant. You look at other rushing quarterbacks who are, the GOATs, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts. Yes, they run. Yes, they score rushing touchdowns. They also have enough passing numbers to where it keeps them afloat. Kyler Murray doesn't really do that. For him, it was always run for a bunch of yards and touchdowns and balloon himself to a good fantasy season that way. And we saw these last few years that when Kyler Murray kind of stopped running, I think he got injury scared after suffering an ACL tear in, I think, 2021 or 2022. He got scared and he kind of stopped running, and since then he's been mediocre as a fantasy quarterback. You look at the raw numbers and he's finished as a top 12 QB every season he's played a healthy season. However, the way he gets there often is by dinking and doinking through the season, playing all 17 games, and scoring, enough points per game to where he is decent. And he ends up in that top 12 QB list, but you look at the game log and he alternates between, games of 18 points, games of 6 points, the occasional game of 20 plus points, but he definitely has weeks where he can lose you a week through his production. And now going through this Vikings offense, though, there is reason you might think that there's a better chance of him succeeding. He's going from Arizona, a team that wasn't always coached by the best coaches. Cliff Kingsbury was something. Jonathan Gannon was also something, and now he's going to a Kevin O'Connell system. And we saw 2 years ago Sam Darnold be elite in a Kevin O'Connell system. He was a fantasy relevant quarterback who you could start. So there's reason to believe that Kyler Murray, with his rushing upside, with a Kevin O'Connell offense, with Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, whatever's left of TJ Hawkinson, could succeed. Kyler Murray could succeed, and he could be a elite fantasy quarterback. I just question because I am very opposed to drafting players who I do not think are good football players. They're good real-life players, not good real-life players, regardless of what they might be doing on the fantasy field. And that's kind of what's always kept me from drafting Kyler Murray is I just don't think he's that good at football. He's a great athlete, and that's ballooned him to a lot of good fantasy seasons, but I don't think he's very good at actually playing football. So that's the only concern I have with Kyler Murray is just that, yeah, he's probably going to win this starting job over J.J. McCarthy. Yeah, he's in a Kevin O'Connell system, but what does that even look like? Is he going to jump up to that 2021 form where he was an elite fantasy quarterback? I don't know. I mean, he's not a significant fantasy price at the moment. He's quarterback 17. But still, sometimes I wonder if it's better just to take a safer quarterback like Bo Nix or Jordan Love, who are going just a little bit ahead of Kyler Murray and who are probably going to rep out a top 12 quarterback season. Because I just wonder, Kyler Murray, is he going to be a consistently good fantasy quarterback, or is he going to do the thing where he wildly varies in his point totals between weeks, which really annoys me? I'd rather have a quarterback who reps out 16 points every week than a guy who reps out 20 one week and then 10 the next week. And will he hold on to this Vikings job the whole time? I think everyone kind of assumes that Kyler Murray is going to be the Vikings starting quarterback through the whole season. But if his play is inconsistent, we could see them go back to JJ McCarthy, because just to see if JJ maybe will improve between seasons, and with the competition of Kyler, could maybe build on his 2025 season, because remember, they spent a first-round pick on JJ McCarthy. They may not be willing to give up on him just yet. So at value, I like Kyler Murray, but he's not a guy who I think some people are really willing to say, you don't need to draft a quarterback, just take Kyler Murray in the late rounds. He'll produce for you. He's always produced for you. I'd be a little bit hesitant on that. If I draft Kyler, I'm probably taking maybe Shuck, maybe Jared Goff, maybe Malik Willis are with him, just because in case the Kyler experiment in Minnesota doesn't go great. But at his current value, I think he's a perfectly reasonable dart throw. He's not my favorite, but I think he's perfectly reasonable. You guys remember when the Texans took Jaden Higgins over Luther Burden? Yeah, that was probably kind of stupid, but there's still a chance that Jaden Higgins could be a guy. And I think there's a chance that he could be a guy as soon as this year. You look at this Texans offense, and it's a little dicey, to be fair. CJ Stroud has regressed massively since that stellar rookie campaign in 2023, primarily because the offensive line has been a little dookie at pass protection these last 2 years. However, they've made another round of attempts to improve it. They brought in David Montgomery, who will be an upgrade over the running game they had last year. And CJ Stroud is in essentially what is a do or die year. He needs to succeed this year if he wants to get that sweet, 4-year, $50 million contract extension from the Texans. Because the Texans are in win now mode right now with their defense. And if CJ Stroud can't put it together this year, they're going to go find some other quarterback who can. And I think in order for CJ Stroud to succeed, he's going to need someone to throw the ball to. He is a pocket passing quarterback. And he's got Nico Collins, but I think that the receiver 2 position besides Nico Collins is a little shaky. I think there is room for anybody to really step into it. Dalton Schultz hasn't established himself as an elite tight end. Tank Dell is coming back this season, but he's coming back from one of the worst injuries I've ever seen live in my life. That man's leg was sideways. I don't know what kind of shape he's going to be when he gets back. And so that leaves the wide receiver 2 and the receiver 2 position overall kind of open for Jaden Higgins, a guy selected at the top of the second round last year, to step into it. And I know it's a little scary to draft a guy who's the second option in an offense that has not been prolific over the last 2 years, with a quarterback who has been struggling. But I think that I like to project that CJ Stroud is going to bounce back this year. I think that CJ Stroud is going to have a bounce back season when it's do or die. He's going to show that he is the guy that is going to be for the Texans' future. And in order to do that, he's going to need to put up some passing numbers. And that's going to entail a receiver other than Nico Collins, I think, being successful. And at his price of wide receiver 51, I think Jaden Higgins is a great shot at that. Like all these other guys, he's free. He's a dart throw, essentially. And I think we saw down the stretch last season plenty of games where he flashed talent. He didn't consistently flash talent. He wasn't fantasy startable last year, but there were plenty of games where Jaden Higgins flashed talent, and he was a very good prospect coming out of Iowa State. So I think that there's no reason to think that he couldn't, maybe, if everything breaks right, show out as a decent, flex option or wide receiver 3 this year. And at his ADP, I think it's perfectly reasonable where, yeah, there is that chance, but also the Texans could just be a little mid. CJ Stroud could not be a consistent passer, and maybe only Nico Collins is a consistent fantasy option. But if CJ Stroud takes that next step forward, I think the guy who will benefit from it will be Jaden Higgins. So as a guy who's a bit of a CJ Stroud believer, I think I'm going to be in on Jaden Higgins this year just as a dart throw that the Texans offense gets back on track. Next guy up I want to talk about is Chig Okonkwo. He's currently the tight end 18, 153rd overall ADP. And Chig recently moved from the Tennessee Titans to the Washington Commanders. And I think for Okonkwo, situation is everything. He's gone from a team who hasn't been very good for the last couple of years, hasn't had a quarterback for the last couple of years, where they haven't really used him as an elite pass catcher for the last couple of years. And he's gone to a team that has a good quarterback and has a very big need for a receiver. And I think that is the most important thing for Chig, is the fact that the Commanders are down bad for any kind of receiving help behind Terry McLaurin. They brought in no significant free agents this offseason. They drafted Antonio Williams in the 3rd round. I wasn't a very big Antonio Williams guy, so I like a Chig Okonkwo over him, I think, as a talent, especially for this season. So I think that there's plenty of opportunity for Chig Okonkwo to establish himself as a relevant fantasy tight end. You look back 2 years during Jayden Daniels' legacy campaign in 2024, and Zach Ertz was a top 12 tight end. Zach Ertz was a set it and forget it guy. Yeah, he busted occasionally, but Jayden Daniels has shown a preclination to liking to feature a tight end. A tight end who many of us thought wasn't going to be, was washed and wasn't going to be fantasy relevant ever. So I think that in this system, there is a chance that Chig Okonkwo could fill that Zach Ertz role and become the number 2 target on this team behind Terry McLaurin, be a guy who's putting up consistently, 10-ish PPR points per week, and just is filling that tight end position that's often so hard to fill. Now, all of this is predicated, of course, on the Commanders not making another free agent signing before the start of the season. And the thing that just scares me is, if I was the Commanders GM, I would sign one of these veteran receivers who's just sitting around, like Keenan Allen, bring back Deebo Samuel. Definitely sign Stephon Diggs. I would definitely sign Stephon Diggs. So the only thing that concerns me slightly is just if the Commanders bring in Stephon Diggs or they bring back Deebo Samuel, I'm out. I don't think there's going to be enough for Chig Okonkwo to have a consistent role. But if you go into the season and that wide receiver, the receiver 2 position is essentially up for grabs on the Commanders, Chig Okonkwo would be my favorite pick to take a swing at who's going to step into that role, just because he's a guy who we've seen flashes of it in Tennessee, never was really able to put it together. He's in a new team where there's plenty of opportunity, with a quarterback who has shown both proficiency and a willingness to throw to a tight end. I don't see a reason why Chig Okonkwo couldn't not only vastly exceed his ADP at tight end 18, but also become a legitimate week in and week out fantasy asset.
All right, last of all, let's talk about Greg Dulcich, Miami Dolphins tight end, and the tight end 35 overall, 270th player. Greg Dulcich is a weird guy because last year he was kind of just a guy. That was all he was. He was a guy, just a guy. He was out there catching passes, blocking. Not a guy really who played fantasy football that you thought about at all. But coming into this season, the Dolphins have completely blown up their receiving corps. Tyreek Hill may be done playing football entirely. Jalen Waddle's now on the Broncos. And that means the receiving corps and tight end is kind of open for really anyone to step up. There's no good receivers. It's Tutu Atwell, Malik Washington, and a few other guys, none of whom have ever shown to be anything more than wide receiver 2s on a good day. And the tight end room that used to have Johnny Smith and then at one point Darren Waller, both of those guys are gone. So you're looking at a receiving corps that has essentially no one in it. And that's probably the entrance for Greg Dulcich to become kind of a camp darling, in the sense of he's a guy who we've never actually seen be good, but the news coming out of Dolphins training camp is that he's emerging as Malik Willis's favorite target. And in a Dolphins offense that has essentially no one to catch the ball, there's no reason why Greg Dulcich couldn't be the guy. Like, there's no reason he couldn't be him. He's not any worse than any of the other guys in this offense. It's just we've never actually seen him be an elite fantasy asset. So it's kind of just all going on the vibes coming out of Dolphins training camp. So with that in mind, I mean, he is a decent enough late round dart throw, and I mean late round though. This is not a guy who you should take with anything more than your second class or last pick. Because there's a high chance that both him and the Dolphins receiving corps as a whole just don't do anything. Like, there's a chance that Malik Willis can't actually lead an NFL offense, or can't lead an NFL offense without
pieces around him. There's a chance that none of the pass catchers actually emerge as fantasy relevant, and that includes Greg Dulcich. He could just be bad. He's been pretty much bad his entire career, and there's no reason to think that has to change this year just because there's opportunity for receiving work. However, at his price, tight end 35, he's free. He's a guy who, if there's a chance that he could step into a fantasy significant role, why not take a dart throw on a guy who is essentially free? So that's Greg Dulcich. He's a guy who you probably want to take in a 2 tight end team draft. You're going to want to have another guy in case this guy busts. But if you need dart throws at tight end at the end of your fantasy draft, he's an option. So with that, those are all the guys who I think have significant upside coming into this year as late round dart throws. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's anyone you would have put on this list, and I'll see you guys in the next one.